Hello, I'm Will. Welcome to ResearchPod. The development of tests and vaccines for the Corona-19 virus marks something of a global success story in drug design and public uptake. However, for reasons that we won't get into just yet, not every disease can receive the same investment of time and money. For example, there are many diseases which have been manageable, if not treatable, for years, but the appearance of new strains has rendered old treatments less effective. Coming up with new molecules to treat a rare strain of a resistant disease means a lot of investment for a small patient population. However, in the face of a surging tide of antibiotic resistance, what can be done to facilitate the creation of new therapies whilst also making economic sense for the companies involved? Today I'm speaking with Olof Lindahl and Chantal Morel, authors of the ASB report on financial incentives for developing new drugs, about the financial tools they propose to support drug development in the face of economic uncertainty.
Hello, my name is Olof Lindahl. I'm a PhD in business studies from Uppsala University in Sweden. I do a lot of research on economic incentives to spur innovation. And how about you, Chantal?
Hi, I'm Chantal Morel. I am a health economist. I work primarily in issues related to infectious diseases.
In terms of infectious disease, Chantal, could you maybe tell us a little bit about how antimicrobial resistance occurs and why it is a problem for people alive today?
So it is a naturally occurring biological phenomenon, but it's made much worse when we use antibiotics very widely. So effectively, well, when you use antibiotics a lot, it builds up something called selection pressure, and then that increases the chance for mutation and resistance to come about through the mutation.
And the human result of that means that the drugs we have don't work and we need to find new drugs. Is that just for old diseases, or are there new diseases coming up that we can't effectively treat?
So that's right. So the effectiveness of our existing set of antibiotics is going down quite rapidly. There was actually just a report that came out, I think it was last week, in the Lancet that quantified the number of deaths from antimicrobial resistance and antibiotic resistance in particular. I think it was 1.27 million deaths are occurring globally per year due to this. And this is putting it really, on par with HIV, with malaria. We're talking those kinds of numbers now. So it's become now not something that's just in the background going on quietly. It's very much a real threat to human health.
Olaf, if I could ask how your experience in economics kind of comes to play in work that you're doing with Chantal and the stimulus package, I guess, that we're talking about.
Right. Well, as you guys just talked about, the drugs we have against a lot of infectious diseases, especially antibiotics, are not working as well as they used to. Some are nearing uselessness. And of course, the bacteria are still there, and we need to find new drugs. And finding new drugs or bringing new drugs to market is something done by pharmaceutical companies, big and small. And that is pretty much not working today. Very few new drugs are being brought to market, and even companies that bring new drugs to market might not actually survive as companies because the profitability of antibiotics is so low. So this is a problem that is huge in the sense that disincentivizes companies from trying, because you don't want to be the next company going into bankruptcy for doing the right thing.
It feels like, to me, not an economist, someone who is developing a new antimicrobial treatment of any sort, that should be a wise investment. That should be something that has tremendous success on the market. How is that not working out for them yet?
So there are three main problems with the market. So one is that we are still using generic antibiotics to treat most infections that we see within health services. And for the most part, they work. The problem is that there are now more and more infections where they don't work. The fact that we have very inexpensive drugs on the market, that's one thing, because it creates a lot of pressure on prices. So there's so that any new products that come to market have a real struggle to attain a high price, or even a, something above a very minimal price is very hard to achieve. The second problem is volumes. So because we try to restrict the use of any new antibiotics, because we want to prioritize the old ones and basically use up their efficacy as much as possible before using new ones, it means that if any new antibiotics come to market, they're barely going to sell. There's a unit sale problem there, really, really low volumes. And then the last problem is that it is very expensive to bring a new drug to market. Clinical trials are extremely expensive. Getting through all the regulatory hurdles is quite difficult. So those three things put together make this a very unattractive market to potential developers.
Right, and to add to that, I think because I could imagine you will asking, well, why are not health system paying higher prices so that you get this system back to health, the antibiotic development system? As Chantal pointed out, there's a history and a tradition of getting antibiotics for next to nothing. And there's also, since antibiotics are so precious because they are life-saving drugs, there's also a hesitance to discuss high prices because that might mean new drugs, but not for everyone. So that is also something holding the idea of raising prices back, and something that then prolongs this unfortunate status quo we have, which is also why both Chantal and I do a lot of research on new ways of incentivizing antibiotic development that are not primarily related to price.
If we could maybe start with the current situation, what's good and what's bad about it. What does that kind of incentive look like? How are those incentives administered at the moment?
So right now there are no real incentives in place. We just have a pretty normal marketplace where, like we said, any new drugs that come to market have to face real competition when it comes to price, and then they're not really sold. So those are the problems. In terms of incentives, do you want to go, Olof?
Sure. So in terms of incentives for antibiotic development, there are the old traditional ones that we might not see as incentives, but basically research grants, quite common in a lot of countries, to researchers and small firms and academic labs working on finding new antibiotics. There are also, to a lesser extent, subsidies to take these antibiotics into clinical trials, much less common than these grant supports I just mentioned. However, what has been talked about much more recently is using something else than prices, which we mention is problematic, to make new antibiotics profitable. And one of those ideas has revolved around innovation prices. The most commonly discussed innovation price has been called a market entry reward, which is essentially a very large prize, maybe in the size of $1.5 billion, where a firm that brings to market a new antibiotic that targets pathogen of particular interest, i.e. an antibiotic we really need, would then get an innovation prize for maybe $1.5 billion, which would then cover all the costs and then some. And the idea with that type of innovation prize, called a market entry reward, is to get companies moving, because this means that there is profitability, not for all of them, but for the winners, if you will. So in other words, something that resembles a normally functioning market, where the winners will take all and some will lose, but it might still on the average be a good investment for investors to support these companies.
And in terms of the finance there, I mean, it's huge in scale. Who is providing that competitive incentive?
Very good question. That is still being worked out, because while it's quite straightforward to realize that that is the size of the incentive to get companies moving through these incredibly expensive clinical trials, etc., who is going to pick up the bill, that has not been as straightforward. However, worth noting is that a couple of countries are trying out different versions of this incentive idea. But of course, if the incentive would be on the scale of $1.5 billion, maybe more than one prize, then of course we're talking about EU-wide, US, or even some kind of collaboration between large countries and regions in the world.
Well, in terms of setting out a plan for doing better for anyone if they can afford it, there was also the Drive AB report that you guys contributed to that was backed by the Innovative Medicines Initiative that laid out what is needed to bring people together and get them aligned on coming up with new structures, new frameworks, and new molecules. Could you maybe give us a whistle-stop tour of that?
So there have been various initiatives to analyze and compare the different possible incentives for antibiotics. The three around which there has been the most consensus, well, the ones that seem most promising, have been the market entry awards, subscription models, sometimes called Netflix models, and also transferable exclusivity vouchers. Those are the three primary ones that have come out of those analyses, I think.
Definitely on the so-called pull award side, where you basically try to create something else than price to incentivize firms to move to the market, to pick up all the costs involved in getting an antibiotic all the way to market. However, part of what Drive AB suggested were also so-called pipeline coordinators, which do have quite a lot of resemblance to some ongoing incentives, such as Carbex enable, partly also Revive and GuardP, which are then partnerships that are in one way or another midwiving these antibiotics development projects by including experts, by including funds, by including labs, so to make the journey much easier and also helping them by picking up the costs along the way. So that is what we call a push model. Not completely different from grants, but a much more hands-on and active version of it. That being said, Chantal, you're absolutely right as far as the pull incentives go. Transferable exclusivity vouchers and market entry rewards that we talk about mainly.
So the pipeline coordinators are a very good way to somewhat level the playing field amongst different types of companies. So smaller companies who often lack certain types of expertise, especially as they get further along with development, if they're part of one of these partnerships, they can usually hang on to the candidate molecule for longer because they're getting this input in areas that where they don't have expertise.
There's a brief mention of a company in your paper on anti-susceptibility bonuses. Is it Achaogen?
Achaogen.
I guess they're an example of when things go wrong.
That's right. So this is it's a good example of how we need whatever pull incentive we choose to really spark interest and maintain interest amongst big pharma. Small pharma can do lots and be extremely innovative in this area, but we do need the pull of big pharma interest. These small companies have been able to get drugs sometimes all the way to market, including with some help from private investors and from public sector support, but ultimately failed because they did not have that the sort of interest from the big fish in the market. Olof, do you see that differently?
No, I agree completely, and I think what I failed to mention earlier is that these pipeline coordinators that help the small developers, the small pharmas forward, they can only help them so far. Because once you get into the clinical trials, especially later in clinical trials, the bill for performing those clinical trials becomes huge. And that's when the big money needs to come in. You might need you probably need a big pharma to support, and you need some kind of profitability to supporting, because otherwise you're just pulling money down a well, and that is not something that companies want to do. That's not something anybody wants to do.
Despite doing really well with getting private investment and public sector support, these companies who have failed, like Achaogen, like Melinta, they had to go into so much debt in order to get these molecules to market, and then even to keep them on the market, that it wasn't tenable. So it is really that broader interest from the market that's lacking, and it is lacking from the big companies.
Looking at your paper in the Journal of Antibiotics, the use of antibiotic susceptibility bonus as giving that incentive of making those successes more likely, of fostering more innovation. If you could tell us all about it.
This paper is the outcome of a project supported by the JPIAMR, so the Joint Programming Initiative on Antimicrobial Resistance, and a project that is performed by a consortium of universities, so University Hospital of Geneva, Faculty of Medicine, Uppsala University, and University of Calgary. So in this project, which contains several researchers that were part of the Drive AB project and thus have been highly engaged with coming up with new incentives to innovation in antibiotics, we realized that some of the most potent incentives, such as the market entry rewards, they incentivize innovation. So they are very powerfully can help pull drugs to market. But once these drugs get to market, the incentive as such, which is the force in play here, does actually nothing to incentivize recall responsible use. So essentially, it doesn't incentivize the future efficacy of a drug. It doesn't incentivize the company owning the patent to make sure the drug will last for as long as possible. Now, this might sound like something you don't need, because why would anybody want to not treat their product with greatest care? However, because of the dire profitability problems in antibiotics, situations might occur where a struggling pharmaceutical company that has developed a new drug wants to recoup their costs. And that might entail selling as much as possible of the drug. I mean, that's basic economics. That's what every company in the world does. But in antibiotics, that's a problem, because potential overuse of antibiotics leads to antibiotic resistance. Therefore, this project set out to design an incentive that could work as an add-on to market entry rewards, for example, which would then incentivize the responsible use from the perspective of the company when it came to new antibiotics.
So there are these large pull incentives that we hope will be put in place. And the antibiotic susceptibility bonus is intended as an added reward if an antibiotic remains effective over time. So it's a bonus that would be paid out, for example, every 5 years if resistance remains low. So there's going to have to be a threshold that's set, and if it goes above that threshold, then they would no longer qualify for these bonus payments. And the idea is here that we don't want any antibiotic to be used unnecessarily, and we also don't want it to be pushed for wider sales than are necessary. So we want there to be, sort of responsible sales, responsible consumption all the way along the chain. So if we can incentivize industry at the very highest level of the chain to want to protect the efficacy of their product over time, then we think that over time we will, maintain a stronger arsenal of antibiotics. We would like to ideally be able to make, lots of specifications on the antibiotic that we want from this, right? We want to be able to say, okay, we would like this antibiotic to be effective against X pathogen. We would like it to have a half-life of whatever. I mean, but the problem is that the more we specify, the more you actually put off potential development in that area. I mean, you want to bring back people with the right expertise to try to develop these products. But if you make it too specific, you are also really raising the bar in terms of what, can be achieved. And there's a lot of uncertainty in this. And having an idea for, drug innovation in the beginning, you actually don't know what you're going to be developing through time. So the more specific you are in terms of what molecule you want to get using these incentives, the fewer number of potential players you have actually trying to produce that product. So you do want to specify the most important criteria or characteristics of the drugs, but you don't want to be so specific that actually you just put off potential developers. So there's a fine line to be had there. And what's important about this antibiotic susceptibility idea is that it's offering this as a reward, as a bonus, not as the reward for development. There's a really subtle nuance there, but it's separate in the sense that we know that there are lots of unknowns here. We know that once the drug gets onto the market, the company only has so much control over how it's going to be used. We think it has some influence on how it markets its product, but there are lots of uncertainties. So it's really saying, okay, if you can develop a product that remains effective over time, you get this bonus. With the long term hope that early on in the development process, they will start to take into consideration resistance characteristics very, very early on, such that we get more efficacious drugs that last longer to the market over time. I guess what's important to note here is that there should be good rewards in the system offered to antibiotics that make it through to approval. If those drugs are able to maintain their efficacy over time, they should be offered this type of a bonus.
It's an investment in time rather than an upfront reward, planning ahead for a future that you might not even get to see, but it does pay off in the long term.
This project is also trying to address what could be called an oversight by partly ourselves, but us and in the community that are working on coming up with these new incentives, because earlier incentives, like the market entry reward and other pull incentives, they are well designed to address the problem of lack of innovation. So they are in different ways trying to help companies recoup the costs of innovation so that they don't go bankrupt, so that they want to do this. And of course, we also want new companies to get into the development of antibiotics. So you want to create this virtuous spiral rather than the death spiral that has been going on for a while. However, what we haven't been thinking about as much until now is what about compensating firms for the cost of restricting their own profitability for the sake of stewardship and responsible use. That is what the antibiotic susceptibility bonus is addressing. We are wanting, from a public health standpoint, we want the companies to restrict sales and marketing. We want them to register their drug for as few indications as possible or as needed. And this is going to cost them in an environment where survival is not in any way guaranteed. And so this is perhaps the first step in trying to remedy that we are expecting things, but the financial message, if you will, is that we are not going to help or incentivize this the least. So to say this differently, I was speaking to some PhD students in the Uppsala Antibiotic Center earlier today, and I talked about the pharmaceutical industry as a machine that society uses for the development and production of drugs. And we are sending messages. And part of the messages are, of course, through legal and regulatory channels, but a very important message is sent via the prices we pay for what they do. And if we're not willing to pay for innovation, there will be no innovation. Antibiotics is a great example of that. If we're not willing, by the same logic, to pay for stewardship or responsible use, we should not actually expect that, because industry, for good and bad, runs on money, not much else. But it also makes it easy for us from a public health standpoint to answer the question, how does this machine work? Well, it runs on money. So if you pay for stewardship through a bonus or any other means, you can get stewardship. If you refuse to, well, you can guess yourself. So we are kind of trying to take the next step in the development of incentives by not only addressing then innovation, but also what we would want, given that we manage to address innovation. If we get new drugs to market, what then would we want? What would we need? What would be the benefit, the best for public health? And that's stewardship.
It feels a bit like that old lesson in psychology of presenting a child with a sweet and saying, if you don't eat this sweet, you'll get 2 sweets later. Except the sweet is a lot of money, and then there's a lot of money later, but there's a lot of money here right now.
Well, yes, you need to be careful with incentives, and both the incentives you use, but also the incentives you don't use. If you expect to get something for nothing, then generally you need to check twice. And I think when it comes to the stewardship and the responsible use of new drugs, but not supporting companies in doing exactly that, it's not the smartest thing. We believe that the antibiotic susceptibility bonus is a step in the direction of helping companies to do this.
We should emphasize, though, that the size of the bonus has to clearly compensate companies for the sales that they did not have, right? The ones that they did not pursue in trying to protect the efficacy of their product. So yes, we're asking them to sacrifice some unit sales. We're asking them not to flood the market with their product, but we're saying, okay, if you've done that, you'll be well compensated because you'll get this bonus. But also, I mean, at the same time, it could be that they develop a really good product that remains effective over time, and that even no matter how much it's used, still remains efficacious. Well, then that also merits a bonus.
I was just about to ask, when it comes to the section in the paper on key aspects of the ASB, you mentioned there the baseline magnitude of the bonus, the post-patent years. Maybe we could recap some of those individually and just break them down into very simple cases of here is what needs to happen, here is who can do that, here is why it will save hopefully hundreds of thousands of lives.
We are still working on establishing what would be the magnitude of this bonus and how would it have to be adjusted to fit various conditions, which is something still being worked out, because of course you want it to be large enough to compensate for the cost of stewardship. You probably also want it to be large enough to compensate for any uncertainty that this introduces. Because sure, companies have costs, but uncertainty is also a kind of cost. Because we can say that we're going to be profitable. You could tell that to your investor. But if you add a maybe, that doesn't have the same ring to it, which means that it has to be big enough to compensate for the costs, but also for the lack of certainty that they will actually get this bonus in the future. However, the magnitude should not be so big that it creates disincentives to making the drug available by different means. This is the access side of this is also something that can be achieved through different means. But of course, you don't want, with the magnitude, to create a situation where a company in dire economic straits might start looking for ways of restricting access, just like we wouldn't want a company to register its drug for more indications than clinically necessary.
See, I'm gonna disagree on this point about indications.
Please, I mean, I'm just go right ahead.
See, to my mind, actually, going for additional indications, I mean, it's more expensive for the company, so it's more difficult for them. But what it does do is it provides a lot more data about the drug. So we get a lot more evidence of efficacy, but also the potential, side effects and such. So having that information is very valuable. So to my mind, actually, we don't want to necessarily put off the application for additional indications. I mean, it's expensive for companies anyways. There's already a deterrent there to go for additional indications. And, if they can sell their drug to be used off label, then I think they're pretty fine with it. As long as it's reimbursed, that's the issue.
No, but this is good. I mean, what about the susceptibility of the drug? How can that be established?
Yeah, determining whether or not a drug is eligible for the bonus is a bit tricky, because at the moment our surveillance, our routine surveillance of antimicrobial resistance does not include resistance to the newest antibiotics. Right now, routine surveillance is only looking at resistance to the older set of antibiotics. So that would have to change. We would need surveillance of resistance to the newer drugs to become far more common in order to do this, in order to gather the evidence that we need. We also would probably want to consider not using what are called breakpoints. At the moment, when we decide that an infection is resistant to a drug, we're using a certain threshold that's called a breakpoint. Now, we could use data from many, many people to decide that on average, the drug goes beyond that breakpoint. Resistance is no longer at an acceptable level, so that drug is not eligible for the bonus. However, these breakpoints do change over time, and we don't want to also be creating a lot of pressure on the panel who creates the breakpoints to change breakpoints. So instead, we could choose another measure that does not change at all, and those are called ECOFs. So basically, it's a different threshold to use to determine eligibility for the bonus. During the patent years, what's important about establishing patterns of use, it's important because actually those are the years when prescribing patterns are set. So usually, if a drug is going to be used very widely, it will start to be used widely during the patent years. But if it remains, a bit more restricted, it will probably move on to have those similar patterns post patent. It may go up a bit, when prices go down after the patent cliff. However, in terms of, common usage, you can kind of count on the pattern being set fairly early on when it's still under intellectual property protection. If we can try to influence how the drug is marketed during those years, we'll have gained a lot. But we also say that, okay, we do think that beyond the patent years, a bonus system should remain in place, so that we're still trying to keep the incentive towards protecting the efficacy of the product. Because in most cases, these drugs do remain very useful way beyond their patent life. So we don't want them just to be flooding the market. We do want them to still be used in an appropriate way.
If these and other incentives, the push and pull incentives, what goes right if they work, what goes wrong if they don't, and what needs to change in the way of the world to make that work.
If these incentives work, then we would reignite interest amongst pharmaceutical companies who perhaps had some interest in this area, 20 years back, but then left. We hope to bring them back to the table. And, it would mean that we'd see new molecules coming to market. So, it would take some years, because it takes, 10 to 15 years to develop a new antibiotic, but we'd see not necessarily a filled pipeline, but a pipeline that's a little less dry than what we see now. It might not be that every antibiotic that would make it through that pipeline would be, some miracle drug. We may end up paying for some drugs that are not perfect. I think that would be somewhat inevitable with this. However, we would have the security of having many new molecules come to market.
And I suppose specifically for the antibiotic susceptibility bonus, it has a number of benefits should it be introduced. One is that it adds this component of stewardship to these large innovation incentives that we've been talking about, something that has so far been missing. So what it would do is to basically up the game a bit when it comes to what is the expected effect of these incentives. So not only would we get new drugs to market, but they might actually stay on the market for longer, and the quality of those drugs might, in the best case scenario, be higher.
It's also, I think, important to note that you can add this type of bonus system to any incentive that you use, any pull incentive that you use. You can tack on this bonus feature, which then adds in this stewardship measure to protect the efficacy of the product. And also, I think it's an important thing to note is that we are talking about very big rewards here being given to companies, and some of these companies are already quite profitable, especially if we can bring in the big players, reignite their interest in antibiotic development. I mean, these companies are known to be highly profitable. So it is going to be politically very difficult to sustain large scale pull incentives over time. So having this bonus feature helps kind of improve the accountability, I guess you could say, because it's saying, okay, we're going to be, incentivizing the production of the best drugs possible, the drugs that remain effective over time, not just throwing large sums of money at anything and everything.
I guess trying to sell it as a wise investment.
Yeah, and something to, in a way, to protect the public interest. We are considering very large scale rewards for companies, and we need to make sure that what we're incentivizing is truly what society needs over time.
And I suppose this is also I mean, you could ask the question, why hasn't this been part of these discussions earlier? Why wasn't this already included in the original incentives that we are now suggesting to tack this onto? Well, first of all, it's a research front issue. So we, of course, first need to identify the incentives before improving upon them. So that's the most important reason. But of course, that doesn't mean that there are not drawbacks to this bonus. And one could be that it complicates things, that you are not only asking companies to come up with new drugs and bringing them to market, but you're also asking for better drugs. You're asking them to steward them, and you're asking the drugs to stay efficacious over the long term, which is adding complexity to anything the companies are trying to do. I mentioned earlier that there's a cost in uncertainty. So if the ASB would ask more of the companies, then they would also be slightly more uncertain as to whether they could actually deliver on it, because they might not know themselves how well will our drug be doing in 5, 10, 15 years. So while it is a great idea, it does increase complexity when it comes to these incentives, for good reason, but still.
Which is why we see the susceptibility bonus really as a bonus and not a reward.
When it comes to resistance, it really is important to underline that these are natural biological processes, and we cannot predict which new resistances or resistance mechanisms will come about in future. So it's unknown what resistances will emerge, the degree to which they'll be transmitted across people or from animals to people are unknown.
To be very slightly catastrophic with a final question, is it too late? If it's not too late, do we get to stop it before it is too late?
Well, clearly everyone, across the world is thinking more about infectious diseases now because of the COVID pandemic. But we need to be careful not to overlearn from our experience with COVID. We saw an immense amount of innovation to try to combat the COVID pandemic, and we've had these vaccines come to market after just 1 year. I mean, it's amazing progress, but we cannot assume that if we were to see an outbreak of resistant bacterial infection, that we would have that same pace of innovation. We have been looking for molecules for several decades now with very, very few results. So this is hard stuff. And we shouldn't assume that if we do have, some worrying evolution when it comes to bacterial infection, that we will be able to react in the same way and so quickly. It does take a long time to develop new antibiotics, so we do need to think about this now.
While it always feels a bit late, what you can see is that governments are seeing it in the similar light now, and you see a lot of new research projects, and you see a lot of pilots of new incentives, and you see new stewardship programs being launched in a lot of countries. So what we're seeing is how more and more stakeholders are getting on board with trying to find solutions to the threat from AMR, which is very promising.
If people who have listened to this want to find out more, where can they find more from you?
If you want to know more about our research, please go to jpiamr.eu and search for antibiotic susceptibility bonus.